Hi, I'm Dr. Marla Payne Thurman, and I'm here today with Carol Weinman, who is going to talk to us on the topic of autism and the criminal justice system. Welcome, Carol. How are you?
I'm doing really well today. I'm really glad to be here, Marlo.
Yeah, it's great to have you. This is a great topic and very timely. Carol joins us, and are you in Philadelphia? Is that where you live?
I'm located in Philadelphia, but I do work all over the country, the United States and internationally, and even more so now with COVID, but I was doing it even before COVID. So I can consult and everything either virtually or they used to fly me in if
Right.
they
Okay.
needed me.
So Carol is an attorney, an autism expert, and an international speaker, mediator, author, and parent. She is a former Philadelphia prosecutor and criminal defense attorney, internationally recognized for her unique and dual expertise in criminal law and the autism spectrum disorder. Ms. Weinman consults nationally on ASD with lawyers, psychologists, educators, and families. She appeared weekly as a legal analyst for CBS affiliated talk show focusing on autism and the law. Ms. Weinman speaks and conducts webinars and trainings, and she has published articles on autism and crime and is currently developing a school curriculum. We're so happy to have you, Carol. Maybe
Thank
you can
you.
start today by telling us just a little bit about your background and kind of how you got into this field of kind of dual legal and autism, because it's kind of an unusual specialty.
Yeah, well, what took me into this field is what I have found takes a lot of people into this field is that I have a personal connection to autism. I was a criminal attorney and prosecutor for over about 25 years or so, 20 some years. And then I got thrown, as we often do, on a different path when my son was born now 25 years ago. And I ended up diagnosing him with autism, with Asperger's at the time. And I say I diagnosed him because it's hard to believe today with everything that's out there, but 25 years ago, you didn't even see anything about autism. And I had to research into the wee hours of the night to try to figure out what was different about my son till I hit that Asperger diagnosis, and I said, that's it. And then it was confirmed down at Children's Hospital. So it was my journey with my son that took me into this world of autism, and actually I ended up becoming an expert in autism. I've been recognized that way as a result of having to go to what I call graduate school in autism. So what happened was I had been practicing criminal law for a long time, and then a colleague is actually the one that planted the seed. We were at a conference, and he said, you know, you'd be terrific down at the Roundhouse or at the police department dealing with people with autism that are being arrested. And I'm like, oh, and he planted the seed. I didn't really do much with it. It kept knocking at my door till finally I realized this is what I should be doing. And so that's why it's been a unique combination, because nobody else really has that combination of autism and criminal law. Most of the time it's psychologists that are versed in autism, and then you have the lawyer, but I happen to have both of them converge. And
That's really interesting. That's
yeah.
really interesting. And by the way, how old is your son now?
25.
25. So you have lived the life and walked the walk.
I have been in the trenches, and I would say it's probably my proudest thing is raising him and having him be able to thrive. And that's why I also want to share my experiences as a parent. My professional life is being a lawyer, but I also do lecture on being a parent and want to even move forward and do that more. That I wanted to help parents have the road easier than what I had. And I do think that there's nothing like living in the trenches of raising a child with autism.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're here today to kind of talk about this topic of autism and the criminal justice systems. And this is a pretty hot topic right now. And obviously we're not going to get into politics and defunding police or anything like that. But what I do want to talk to you about is kind of we're seeing these cases, and we have always seen them, but they're of course in the media more now about individuals with autism finding themselves engaging with police, and sometimes that not going real well. Can you talk a little bit about that, and what do you think is going on with that right now?
Oh, sure. It is interesting that it is such a hot topic now, because I was started out doing this before it was a hot topic, and people would say, "Oh, that's really important," and move on. And then once it hit the news, all of a sudden, it takes on a life of its own now. And nobody could believe that there could be that many cases out there that involved people on the spectrum being arrested, that would be enough to keep me busy. But there are, unfortunately. What the reason for this, the reason that this has been happening is that there are behaviors that are common to those with autism spectrum disorder. And a lot of these behaviors are misinterpreted or misunderstood by the general public, and that also includes untrained law enforcement. So, for example, the reason we're seeing them getting arrested or things going wrong is, let me first address the getting arrested. They behave in ways that call attention to them unintentionally, because some of their behaviors to the untrained eye look suspicious. For example, they may walk down the street and they have sort of a funny gait, and it calls attention to a police officer who may think, something's different about them. Maybe they're drunk, maybe they're whatever, something to call attention to them, where the police officer may feel a need to investigate. And that's one of the ways. Another one is that they happen to be extremely curious. It's just the way a lot of people on the spectrum are. They need to know why something is happening, or they want to go explore. And the way that will sometimes play out, they might go looking in an area that they shouldn't be in through a window. They might be curious about somebody and start following or staring at them in a way that makes the person very uncomfortable. And then the person calls the police saying, "I'm being stalked, I'm being harassed." These are some of the ways that they are having these encounters with police. And unfortunately, once the police officer walks up to them, then we have another problem of how the interaction takes place. And the person with autism often will have sensory issues. They don't want to be touched. So it starts this spiral of an officer going up to them and touching it. Then they end up, defensively, either pushing the officer away, flailing their arms, screaming, and then the next thing we know, they're often slapped with resisting arrest, which is a very serious crime. We are also seeing a lot of crime, unfortunately, in sex offenses, and that's a whole another topic. But there are the issues of, it gets into this whole concept of theory of mind, where people with autism spectrum disorder assume that you are thinking what they are thinking. And this whole issue of consent gets in there, which is a topic in itself, where they think if they want it, then the other person wants it. They don't realize that they're doing something forceful, let alone criminal. So the intent of the crime is really missing. And so those are some examples of why we're seeing more of this. And we're also seeing more of it because the law enforcement, the police officers do not understand what they're seeing. There was a case in Arizona where a well-known case that was in the news, where an individual, a boy, was stimming. And so he was sort of like twirling his fingers and looking down, and he called attention to a police officer, and they had no idea what was going on. They thought he was on drugs. And he said to them, "I'm stimming." And they're like, "What's that?" And so there's a lot going on in this area, too much to cover in a short time, but that in a nutshell is a little bit of why we are seeing so much of this. And yeah.
Well, and you brought up a really important topic when we talked a couple weeks ago about the idea of, it's kind of a deadly combination to be both Black and autistic. Can you take just a minute and talk about that?
Well, that's a double whammy. Yes, now with the whole movement going on and all the coverage we're seeing between um, Black suspects and how they're treated by police. Um, if you have a suspect who is Black or of color and then also has autism spectrum disorder, um, their police are going to be even more mystified, and they're going to be even more targeted because we already, and I don't really want to speak too much to the issue of what's going on with law enforcement and Black Lives Matter movement and all of that, but when you take that issue and then on top of it you put an individual with autism spectrum disorder, you're going to have a double stigma, you're going to have a double um, possibly not even deliberately on the part of the police, but a double mistreatment of possibly or not handling it in the appropriate manner. So yeah, you've got an issue there that gets even more complicated, for lack of a better way to say it.
I think that's, yeah, and again, really knowing that it's that looking different, it's that acting different or behaving in a way that is kind of suspicious looking, I think is kind of your key point of how these kids kind of get picked up and, you know, then they're interacting in a way that's not going to go down real well always.
Yeah, I mean, they even have cases where, you know, kids walking around with autism spectrum disorder, they might have on a hat to shield from light or dress differently, you know, how some people are picked out with hoodies. And so you have that with people on the spectrum too. They may dress differently or inappropriate for the moment. And a police officer is going to, you know, the eye's going to go to that as well. And they can also often appear odd, you know, just because they are different. And the fact that their brains are so different, police officers there is no way, unless they are trained, for them to understand what that looks like. There's no way for anybody to understand. That's why this educational piece is so important.
And you know, you make a good point. It's not just police officers, it's the entire first responders and even the general public. If we don't know what we're seeing, then we don't know how to react. So that moves us kind of into the next question I have for you. What kinds of things are you kind of working with or recommending in terms of prevention and kind of how to address this issue? Because it sounds like for so many of our kids, it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, and it's a big nut to crack. You know, it's interesting. I'm just going to divert for 1 second into the fact that when I started out my criminal law career, I was very passionate even then about how people with mental illness were being treated in the system. And it was very troublesome to me. And this is very similar in that regard, in that it's very disturbing to me how people with autism spectrum disorder are being treated in the criminal justice system. And I don't just mean by law enforcement officers. I want to be clear about that. Once they get past that point, there's also problems with how the judges are viewing them. There's problems with how the probation officers are viewing them. There's trouble with if they do get incarcerated, that's a whole nother problem with how they are treated in jail and how poorly they fare in jail. But in terms of what needs to be done about this, the reason I brought up the mental illness issue, and look how many years, I don't know if people are aware, it's taken for that issue to be brought to the forefront. I mean, we're talking over 20 some years from the time I first saw the issue to them now actually having some programs in diversion and recognizing mental illness for what it is. And autism spectrum disorder is in its infancy that way. We're at the very beginning of this process in the criminal justice system. And what makes it more difficult, Marlo, is that at least with mental illness, there is a little more of a one size fits all, a little more. If you have bipolar disorder, we know pretty much what we need to do. And usually everybody might react a little different to a medication or whatever, but we tweak it. With autism spectrum disorder, as Stephen Shores is known for quoting, If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And that makes this so much more challenging to deal with. We can't do a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's what makes it so much more complicated as well for people to understand. You know, when I speak about this, and you can tell I get really passionate as I'm talking about it, because it bothers me when people think you can take one course or two courses and all of a sudden you understand autism. It's very complicated and it's very subtle, especially with people more high functioning. And it took me over 20 years to get the understanding that I have, both personally and professionally. So I do have a particular problem with people, you know, think that you can learn it in one training course or one class. And sometimes I think when you asked about, I'm speaking to prevention, it may be a long way getting around it, but it's that I don't believe, and this is why I think we are not being successful this way. There are training courses going on across the country, some in more states more than others, with police officers. I am not seeing that as being a huge improvement. It has helped somewhat, and in certain areas, they're definitely seeing improvement. It's certainly better than not being trained. I've done law enforcement training. They've come up and said, thank you so much. I understand it better, whatever. But it's not enough, the training that's going on. I believe it has to be a lot deeper to get a deeper understanding of this disorder. And that's part of what I have been working on. That, and also judges have to understand it better. Everybody in the criminal justice system. I do lecture to lawyers. I've given seminars and webinars so that they can better understand it when they have a client. However, that's not enough either. And that's why I've come in and consulted on cases, because when you have a individual who's arrested, the criminal case, in my opinion, becomes about autism, not about the offense. So you don't treat that case the same as you do when you have a neurotypical criminal defendant and you're focusing on the crime and the statute and the offense. When you have a defendant with autism, the focus is on the autism, because that's usually why this happened. Now, again, I'm going to qualify it. If there's another disorder going on at the same time, some comorbidity, which does happen, then yes, there may be another reason. But if autism spectrum disorder is the main or only disorder going on, or difference going on, then that is usually the crux of the case. So in terms of prevention, it is number one, as I know everybody knows this, is education. Education. We always talked about awareness. Okay, we've had awareness for a while now. It has to be more than awareness. It has to be a deep understanding. There has to be more education for people to really be able to step more in the shoes of people with autism and understand what they're living. And so I think prevention is education, but on so many levels. If we're going to talk about the criminal justice system, it has to be from, you said first responders also, but law enforcement, through to people in the courtroom, court personnel, judges, lawyers, probation officers, guards, prison guards. It has to be all the way through for this to really have any success. So
do you think that requires some kind of a global systemic change, or is it a curriculum? Or if you could wave your magic wand, what would that be, Carol? What would that look like?
What would that look like?
Yeah.
I think it means it requires a very interactive training. I don't think it works to have a lecture only, or to have a manual only that says, well, when you meet a person with autism, don't talk loud. When you meet a person with autism, don't touch them. That's important. And I think that it has been valuable to have that be out there, but it's not enough. It's just not enough if you don't understand why a person with autism is behaving or reacting the way that he or she is, then just doing those simple to-do lists, I don't believe are enough. I think it has to be more interactive, participatory type classes, more like a workshop, ongoing at different levels. And the curriculum I'm talking about that I'm trying to develop, yes, that would more be for families and parents and people, individuals with autism. But for professionals and law enforcement, I believe it needs a very intensive training. And that can also be costly. So then we have another issue, but that's what I believe is required. And I think that it would actually be relieving on the part of a lot of those people if they understood it better. And I think that their perception then of people with autism would be very different.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think our viewers also appreciate that, Carol. So I want to talk to you a little bit about your curriculum and some of the things, but let's talk first about kind of how the law addresses individuals with autism who have committed a crime. Can you kind of walk us through that whole process a little bit?
Sure. Well, again, we are in our infancy on this. What has happened, Marlo, is that the law has not caught up with autism yet. What has happened is that a lot of people with autism spectrum disorder ended up getting to the age, once they hit like teenage into young adult, that's when we started to see a lot of this. Because that's when they start to get involved with the criminal justice system. And so the criminal justice system was taken by surprise. They had never dealt with people with autism spectrum disorder before. And all of a sudden, they're getting inundated with this population. And so the law does not often move quickly anyway. And we don't have a law that's really set up to address autism spectrum disorder. And to explain that a little better, we have provisions in the law for mental illness, but autism spectrum disorder is not a mental illness. It's a neurological developmental disorder. And this is a huge distinction. So oftentimes when I've spoken on this topic, people will often want to go to, oh, well, then I guess we're going to deal with them, similar to the way we deal with someone with mental illness. No, it doesn't, that's not appropriate. So the law has not really caught up with autism yet. Time will tell what is going to happen with that, whether there will be new legislation, whether there will be what I was hoping for, diversion programs, and maybe more intervention, sort of the way they went with drug courts that took a long time to get to too, where they're dealt with in a separate arena. But in terms of how the law treats them, I have had to advocate strenuously and passionately when I have had clients with autism to be able to open up the minds of the people making the decisions, whether it be the district attorney's office or the courts, to look at this individually differently. So in terms of how the law has treated them, they really don't have a blueprint for this. It has been more that I have had to go in on an individual basis with a particular client. And I have to tell you, I am so rewarded on this. I feel so rewarded in the outcomes that have been so successful in getting most people that I've had to deal with, whether it be the district attorney's office or the courtroom, to get them to open their minds, the judges. Sometimes it takes a lot of persistence and more pushing. They're not always open to it at first, and they have some preconceived notions. And I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention, Marlo, that and that we also need to recognize, and I'm very sensitive to this, that the courts and the community are do feel it's very important to know that this individual is a safe person. So even if I'm standing here saying, oh, you have to, I am on the side of the perpetrator because they have a disorder and they really aren't violent and whatever, that's all well and good. But if they really there is no way to assure that this person is safe, then we have to be sensitive to that's the view that they're taking. And it's not a wrong view. So these are some of the issues that come into play when we're dealing with the law, and some respect for it on both sides. It's funny because when I talk on this topic, a lot of people's minds, when they think of people with autism spectrum disorder, is the person being the victim of bullying, the victim of teasing. And they are victims, but they also are on the other side where they are offenders, and they're not doing it knowingly or wanting to commit an offense. It's not done with intent.
What I'd like to do maybe for this last little section is maybe kind of talk about, I know you and I had talked about, you wanted to talk a little bit about your curriculum and some of the things you're working on. And I know you had kind of talked about maybe doing kind of some things throughout the year. So let's talk a little bit about what you would like to do and what you'd like to see, what kind of contributions you'd like to have in the coming months as part of this conference, and also just to get information out to the general population. What are the topics do you think are the needed ones?
Right. Well, in my work with autism these past several years, I come up against a lot of ideas and issues that have come to the forefront for me only through working with the population, through working in this field. And so while I'm very passionate and committed to crime and autism, there are other areas in autism that I speak to, and ones that I would like to branch out into more, that I'm feeling a strong passion about and commitment to. Some of those are coming from the viewpoint of a parent. I do many lectures as a professional, but I've also spoken to parents, and I'm very interested and committed to wanting to share the information I have about what needs to be the focus, I think, of a parent dealing with a newly diagnosed child or one that's hitting teenage years. In terms of some of the things I learned, in terms of things that I think you could only know, I really do, by raising a child, or things. It's really interesting when Stephen Shore, I'll mention his name again because we're friends, when he has talked about his childhood and what his parents did with him is very much what I did with my child, just by instinct. And it works. A lot of it works, and I would like to share more of that, more of my personal story as well. In terms of the curriculum, I have been asked by many educators to work on a curriculum for young adults on the issue of their interactions with police officers, their interactions with law enforcement. There's so much emphasis that's been done on the other side, training the police officers, training the people in the system. But we also need to focus on the individuals with autism spectrum disorder. And so I would like to branch out more and working on some projects that deal more with seeing certain things through their eyes and having people understand more what their issues are, their struggles, their challenges. And I don't pretend to say I know what it's like to have autism spectrum disorder, but I do have a certain insight, I think, that I can bring, that I am anxious to put out there, that I think has not been addressed yet. So that's the best way I think I can answer that. And I'm excited about doing it with with your organization because I believe in the work that you're doing. I think it's a terrific, wide audience on all levels, and so it's exciting. It's exciting to be doing some new stuff that I believe still needs to be put out there.
And that's awesome. And by the way, I think you make a really, really good point because, yeah, we can only do so much in training police officers without really, and Stephen Shore, we talked about him 3 times, so I might as well talk about him more. But I watched the session when he was talking about, teaching a young man how to, walk into a bathroom and keep their eyes where they need to be and not be gawking around. That
Right.
puts them in harm's way, and it puts them into a situation where they could get assaulted. So all of those things. And by the way, I thought that was a really good example because it's something you don't even think about. You don't teach other neurotypical young men how to walk into a bathroom and keep their eyes where they need to be. And it's not because these kids are necessarily, inappropriate or trying to, get a hookup. It's just they really don't have that skill set. And so I think so many times we're really misinformed as a general population about the skill set we need to be teaching our kids, and certainly interacting with police officers and law enforcement and paramedics and all of those things is part of that. And I think that's really, really critical.
And I just, there's so much needless suffering that way. Yeah. I see such heartbreaking situations with these individuals, and it doesn't have to be that way. And it's really, and I really feel for the parents. That's what I want to make a point to say, having been a parent and am a parent, but at an earlier time where I was scared and lost and didn't know what to do, and these parents have so much to deal with that I would like to help them do something with this piece, because what happens is, in my experience now, having done this for a while, is the parents come to me and they say, oh, I would have never believed that my son would be arrested. I would never believe that my son, they're astonished, like this never even occurred to them, for good reason, because they didn't see the signs and they didn't think this could happen to their son. And truthfully, it can happen to anyone.
Well, and that's why your work is so important. So yeah, we really look forward to, contributing and working with you and building some additional content. And for our viewers, you guys can check Carol's page at the usautism.org website, and she'll have that information up as it becomes available. Thank you so much, Carol, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, and your information is so valuable to so many people. So
thanks so much, Marlo, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.